grief and loss, in particular, just kind of how we as care providers can be sensitive to topics about grief and loss, which seems to be a really good time. A lot of families, I think, are struggling right now due to COVID, but also for other reasons. And children have their own sort of grieving process as they've had to be separated, at least temporarily, from loved ones and from school. So, Alice was one of my many mentors at Seattle Children's when I was there, and has been like just an avid supporter, advocate, comfort to families who are in a point of crisis, particularly with their children. And she has had many support groups that she has co-facilitated over the years, and has since taken up directorship of the Journey program to lead it into new places. So I'll let her tell you a little bit more, but I just can't say enough wonderful things about Alice. I've seen her in action. She has deep, deep, deep compassion for all families, and she brings a really important lens. I would trust Alice with any member of my family who is going through a difficult time, and I would probably guess that would be the same for just about any family. So she finds ways to connect with folks across differences and just with a level of humanity that is truly, truly wonderful to witness. So Alice, thank you so much. You could have done so many other things on this beautiful sunny day, but you decided to share your time and insights with us, and I so appreciate it. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really great to see everyone here. I'm so glad that everyone is here inside or outside, wherever you are listening to this. And I'm just very happy that we can be together today. And Laura will be helping. Thank you, Laura, for helping with the technical side. And I've also asked Laura and Sarah to also just monitor the chats so that they can facilitate any kind of questions or comments along the way. And this presentation is really, I'm hoping this presentation elicits more conversation and thoughts and sharing of knowledge, because I have no doubt that this group knows so much more even than I do. And so this is what this space is about too. So without further ado, I'll be talking about grief and bereavement and looking at it from the utilization of like a trauma-informed lens. We can certainly borrow from that knowledge base to use in grief support for patients and families that we encounter. So Laura, if you can just forward to the next slide, please. And before I start, not a lot of people want to talk about grief and loss and bereavement. So I'm always really grateful when communities can come together and practitioners in particular can come together to talk about grief and loss and bereavement so that we can be more better grief-informed community. Because grief is not something that you wear, it's something that you internally experience inside. And so once you kind of become a grief whisperer or more grief informed, you can certainly like feel its energy, and then therefore you can make space for it in your interactions with patients and your families. So thank you for being willing to be more grief informed in your practice. So what is grief and what is bereavement? I wanted to just make this differentiation right away in the beginning, that sometimes grief and bereavement are used interchangeably as if they're synonyms, and they're not. Bereavement, first of all, is a universal human experience that is about deprivation or separation. Everyone goes through it, in this universal way. And the common experience of bereavement crosses across cultures. Every culture, every human experiences bereavement. It's like that act of being separate or losing something, or being deprived of something or someone. Now, however, grief is very individual and it's extremely subjective. And when you boil it down, it is the individual stress response to separation and or deprivation. So it is the stress response. So that's then what we are responding to when we are interacting with patients and families that are going through grief. So you're not interacting with bereavement, you are interacting with the grief experience, and that's what you're responding to. So again, there's a universality to bereavement, and then there's a contextual, individual subjectiveness to grief. So just wanted to kind of clear that up because I know that gets, again, used so interchangeably, and it's not meant to. Okay, go ahead, Laura. So first of all, gosh, grief is such a human trait. I mean, just look at our bodies and how we're made, that we are built to form significant attachments in our lives. Excuse me, my printer is going for some odd reason. Okay, sorry about that. That was a little creepy that it just started going. So we are built to form significant attachments because biologically it's very adaptive. Just look at our hands. It's meant to grasp. It's meant to hold somebody. It's meant to hold something. Our arms are meant to hug. It's meant to contain. It's meant to show comfort and provide physical comfort. It's built for intimacy, our bodies. And then you take a look at our brains. You know, when we're first born as human beings into this world, we are completely helpless compared to, let's say, a deer or a horse that can run within 2 to 3 hours of being born. They can be kind of functional species, you know, shortly after birth. But for us as humans, we are completely helpless. You know, we are completely dependent on our caregivers for feeding, for support, for safety. We're very vulnerable when we're born. And that means our brains then are made to learn and grow from observation of relationships and experiencing of relationships in the external world. And so therefore attachment is really the basis of what we need to pay attention to when we're supporting somebody who is grieving. So please up forward, thank you. So then because of this biological adaptation to attachment, separation then is an inherently traumatic experience for human beings. Yeah. It just is. And it is, it feels unnatural, you know, because again, we're so adaptively built for attachment that when separation happens, it is an emotionally traumatic experience. We experience then grief, which is again the stress response to the separation that we are not used to. You know, that it feels again unnatural to have this separation for significant relationships. Think about just the amount of emotional investment, physical investment in attaching to somebody. And so that kind of investment when it's lost is traumatic. And then you layer that with all of the other traumatic experiences of separation that we perhaps will not necessarily explicitly see when we are supporting somebody who's grieving. It exacerbates grief, such as, you know, the experience of grief of immigration or forced migration here to our country. Our region is still really, is still considered a safe haven for refugees to come. The experience of grief due to poverty, the experience of grief in different types of death, whether it's a violent death or a sudden death or an unnatural death, like an accident or an overdose. And then, the nature of the relationship, like the parent-child, if a parent loses a child, it's a more intense or acute grief experience because of the nature of the attachment. It could be a sibling death, could be a spousal death, or a child experiencing a death of a parent. And so the nature of the attachment also exacerbates the grief experience. So again, I can't stress enough the individuality and the subjectiveness of the grief experience for everyone. There's just such a variety, like millions, billions of ways to grieve because it's so personal to that person experiencing it. Okay, Laura, you can advance. So, how do we support people who are grieving? The very good news is that grieving is inherently adaptive, that we have this built in, that nature has also built in this inherent capacity for us to adapt to separation that happens in our lives. So not only is attachment highly adaptive for us to exist as human beings, because we're such social creatures, that thank goodness that nature also provided this inherently adaptive process for us, and it's called grieving. A father gave me this quote: "The cure for grief is grieving," and he said this with such grief. He's like, "Is there really not another way to deal with my grief?" Nope, there isn't. It's the grieving process itself helps you adapt to grief and loss. So the promotion of the grieving process and the non-interference of the grieving process is something that we can do for people who are grieving, is actually really emphasizing and validating their grieving process and their emotions that come out of processing their loss and not interfering with it. I think what happens is it exacerbates, again, the stress response by kind of societal standards of what grief should look like. Again, a typical bereavement leave for employees such as myself here in the state of Washington is 3 days. You get 3 days off for bereavement. Look at what's happening during COVID now, or it's what's been happening in this past year, the rituals of grieving and mourning and burials have been interrupted and have been interfered with, and how that can exacerbate the grief process, the grief experience, because there hasn't been kind of these platforms to the adaptiveness of the grieving process. So really one of the keys here is to not interfere with that inherent innate capacity that we have, which is grieving. So enhancement of inherent adaptation process, like crying, is normal and should not be mitigated or suppressed. One of the key referrals I always get here in the Journey program is, "Alice, can you please see this mom ASAP because they're having a hard time?" And I always say, "That's good. That's good." That means this person is normal. And I'm not going to interfere with her normality. It's like, I can't fix that, because fixing it means you're asking me to bring their child back. I can't do that. What I can do is to listen and to be present and to make space for their tears, to make space for the anger or the frustration or the guilt that can come up when you're grieving. And again, all of these human emotions in the grief process is meant to help you adapt to the loss. And again, grieving is very personal. So I think part of our task is to find out who this grieving person is. Another quote that I'm going to quote from another parent who told me that you typically grieve the way that you live. And what I mean by that is, if you are a person before your loved one has died, or before this person that's in your life before they died, if you're a person that tends to be what somebody would describe themselves as, I need structure in my life. I'm kind of a type A personality. Their grief process will reflect that kind of characteristic or that way of living. So in the grief process, it could look like, you know what, Alice, do you have any suggestions on books that I can read that can help give me structure and a framework for my grief? Do you have recommendations of rituals that I can incorporate during my day? So they want some structure because that's how they also lived. They also lived that way. And so people go back to what they know. So if they know themselves to be a structured person, that is what's going to help comfort them in the first few months or even years of their grief process. It doesn't mean they won't change. Change happens slowly and over time. But initially, those are the things that people tend to go back to, are their go-to characteristics. And so if a person is much more kind of intuitive and intuitive in the way that they lived. They're going to be intuitive in their grief too. They might be the type of person that will go out in nature and go hiking. And when they see a feather on the ground, they'll say, oh my gosh, this is a sign from my child, or this is a sign from my spouse who loved birds. And this is super comforting, for me. And I'm going to keep this feather as kind of these reminders for myself that my loved one is everywhere, that they're very present. And so again, that's more of an intuitive person. And that's why, as you can see, like the grief process is so variable and it's so personal to the person who's going through it. So there's not this prescriptive way to grieve. So again, our key thing is for people who are supportive of people who are grieving is to not get in the way and not to interfere with what their inherent capacity is. Okay, if you can forward, Laura. I'm going to mention ACEs here a bit because this group is knowledgeable of that. I feel like I couldn't get away from not mentioning that. So I'm going to mention ACEs and the Pearls 9 as well. And this is from a recent study that was done by two psychologists. One, I think Elizabeth Cronk is a psychologist from George Washington University, and I think Linda Burke, I think Linda is her first name, is from the University of Memphis. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but they did a recent study of what contributes to people's what's called complicated grief. And I put that in quotes for myself as somebody who, I'm not saying that I don't buy the concept of complicated grief. I think that happens, but I always just say like all grief is complicated because all human beings are complicated. I think what they're talking about when they say complicated grief is, is grief that is quote unquote maladaptive. So grief maybe that is not progressing in this adaptive way. But again, it feels a little provocative for me because there's just so many different ways of grieving, and the time frame for how you really adapt is so different for everyone. But I want to mention this because this is out there. It's research material that's out there. And what they did find, and I think you would agree with this, is that the things in ACEs and Pearls 9 that can contribute to the complication of a maladaptive grieving are abuse and neglect, and then caregiver separation, incarceration, housing instability, and caregivers' serious physical illness or death. And if you can look at these, you can see that there are these key themes here that are happening, that these are what can interfere with adaptation, because these are experiences that impact relationship experiences and separation experiences. They impact attachment. The attachment concept or the attachment experience. So these earlier experiences may lead to complications of grief acuity, like it could just be more acute that it's harder to adapt to it. and the persistence of the acuity. And this may interfere then with the natural grief adaptation process of people. However, as you all know, these scores don't tally all of the positive experiences in early life that can also help build resiliency and protect a child from the effects of non-adaptive grieving. So, for example, such as having a grandparent who loves you, a teacher who understands and believes in you, or a trusted friend, or a trusted, mentor, a trusted caregiver, community provider like ourselves that can model trusting relationships, that can model an investment in new relationships that they can create with health. And so anyway, again, I just wanted to mention this as positive or as possible impacts to the interference of a healthy or more adaptive way of grieving or grieving experience. Okay, thanks, Laura. So trauma-informed, so let's pull that in now too. Trauma-informed approach to grief support entails going back to the very, very basics, going back to basics for sure, that there isn't anything I think that I'm going to say here in the next few slides that are revolutionary or innovative. It's about reminding us that we already have the basic skills to be a very present grief supporter for people. And so what I mean by that is the following. Laura, if you can advance. So going back to this concept of attachment, not concept, but the experience of attachment that's already very natural to us. Taking from attachment theory is the process of attunement, which is the process by which we form trusting and very meaningful relationships with people. So when we attune with others, we allow our own internal state to shift, to come to resonate with the inner world of another person. This resonance is at the heart of the important sense of feeling felt that emerges in close relationships and trusting relationships. So children need attunement to feel secure and to develop well. And throughout our lives, we need attunement to feel close and connected. And so that's what is going on when somebody is expressing grief or experiencing grief in front of you, is that they don't need you to fix it. They need you to be attuned with their grief process and the grief emotions that are coming up and manifesting. And so that requires for us to internally shift in a way that we can provide resonance. It's like not plucking, but it's almost like you're trying to tune into the right channel. If you have, I can't believe I still have this, but a super old radio station, and you're just trying to find that frequency and the AM station. And so attunement is an art form, not just a science, but it is an art form for you. It requires you to be calm and very, very, very present so that you can move your dial on your radio to find the right frequency that this other person is on. And that's when congruent attunement really, really happens, or what's called embodied attunement from a provider like ourselves. Laura, if you can forward. So what does this look like in adults, in true attunement in adults, or embodied attunement in adults? In an adult relationship, attunement might be an adult who knows that I'm fine. We hear that a lot from kind of the people that we support, like, I'm doing fine, I'm okay, I'm hanging in there. Might not actually mean that. And so, for us, we dig a little bit deeper to find out what's really going on. It's being plugged in on a deeper level, which requires being fully present and non-confrontational, paying attention to body language, your tone of voice, methods of conveying presence. And so, not necessarily saying, well, gosh, I don't think you are fine, like, tell me the truth, that's more confrontational. So it's about, well, tell me what fine looks like for you today. What does that look like for you? Have them describe what being fine is. Have them describe their current emotional state. And again, that's the beginning of like fine tuning, finding that right channel so you can get into the frequency of that person. Making space for, gosh, I'm not able to read what's below this. making space for like implicit or non-obvious kind of expressions of grief. You know, it's like really trying to get into the next layers of the emotions that people are maybe trying to suppress with you, or don't really have words for. And I mean, I'll talk about this in just a few seconds here, but grief is not processed in our neocortex at all. And that's why it's so important to utilize a trauma-informed approach. Because truly, like what a trauma-informed approach is not functioning in your neocortex, but actually using your limbic system or our emotional brains to be able to attune to somebody. And that's where, again, grief is processed in that part of our brains, not in our logical brains. If you can move forward, Laura. And working with kids, you know, children are not little adults, you know, as much as we want them, as much as we think that they are, they really are not, you know, they don't have a fully built brain yet. So they experience and navigate the world very, very differently. They navigate it more with their limbic systems, actually. You know, there are a bunch of them. They're just like their head is like an emotional brain. They don't have their neocortex yet. And so to reason with a child while they're grieving is extremely frustrating for a child. And you can experience then discordance with a child when you're trying to explain too much in language. And so again, it's about like attuning to a child's normal and natural processing, which is all emotions at this point, because they don't have mastery of language. They have mastery of energy and emotions. Laura, if you can advance. So attuning with a child is attuning with the adult. You know, children come with adults. And so that's the context of children. So again, grief is contextual, bereavement is universal. So paying attention to context of children, they come with some kind of caregiver and adults. So this can include, again, like caregivers that are not necessarily parents, but caregivers who take care of them, teachers, other caretakers, agency staff, us. You know, we're here, we are part of the context of children. Children absorb energy. And then without, again, full command of verbal skills, they utilize behavior and emotions to communicate. And so if they are going through something, they're going to tell you through their behavior. And so again, it's about attuning to the behavior and not correcting it right away. So you have to like really provide some good psychoeducation with parents or their caregivers to let them know that grief is expressed in this way. So if they correct the behavior, how that resonates or registers to a child then is that my feelings are incorrect, or my feelings, are wrong. And so you want to be able to make space for a lot of behaviors that show up. And, you know, I'm not saying like all behaviors are okay. You know, it's supportive of the behaviors and putting boundaries around behaviors, especially if it starts to feel unsafe for them. But it's addressing like what's behind the behaviors and what's motivating the behaviors to happen, and what the emotions are being motivated by is what you need to respond to. And then paying attention to developmental stages of each child and brain development. So for very, very young kids who don't know permanence yet, death is a very difficult concept to understand. And so again, don't try to correct what children are experiencing. So for children who don't know or have not yet conceptualized permanence, when a child says, you know, grandpa is going to come back tomorrow, I can't wait to see him, you know, don't correct it right away. Don't say, well, he's not going to be here, he has died, or he's dead. Again, it is acceptable for sure to be pretty blunt and use the right words, because again, children are learning. They learn from us. They learn language from us too. But don't correct it right away. It's like, well, you know, when you see him, what do you think you're going to say? You know, and again, you have to adjust for culture. There are, you know, so many different cultures that might find that strange, or some cultures that might find that completely acceptable. So you need to also adjust by culture, but know that you then have to layer that with the developmental stage of a child. An example that came up very, very recently for us is it's an 11-year-old who lost her father, unfortunately, to COVID. He died pretty quickly. And we received this referral last year, in the summertime. He died in the summer. And again, she's 11. And one of the first things that our pediatric grief coordinator here did when they were meeting is, you're trying to get to know this child, and she asked the question of, how have you been feeling since your father has died? And she looked at her through the Zoom screen and said, "What are you talking about? Like, my father's not dead. Like, I'm actually going to see him pretty soon." And I think out of panic, our own clinician here said, "Well," she panicked and she's like, "Oh my gosh, there's something wrong with her cognitively because she's 11. Like, she should know that this, that her dad is dead." And so she then kind of started doing these cognitive testing questions, like, do you know the concept of death and all this stuff, instead of, again, leaning into the process of this child and going with it and just saying, "Yeah, well, when you see him, have you thought about what you're going to say to him?" And so again, use it as a conversational piece, use it as a way to engage a child. Because at 11 years old, like, that developmental stage is, they're about to like launch into more kind of peer relationships, but yet they're also grieving the loss of being a little kid. And so there's that grief for a loved one, and also an anticipatory grief for who they were before, developmentally as 11, 12. And obviously there's a range of an 11 and 12-year-old emotional experience, but just because they're 11, don't try to kind of make that assumption, oh, they know permanence, so I should be doing cognitive testing on whether they have a deficit or not of not knowing what death really means. Don't kind of launch into that right away, but like lean into what this child is saying, because again, separation is inherently traumatic. And then you layer that with what was happening in June and July at the height of the pandemic here, where there were no visitation allowed in hospitals. And so this child did not see her father take his last breath, didn't see him for 4 days. He was in ICU for 4 days, and he died suddenly in the ICU after 4 days. So that suddenness is also extremely traumatic for children. And so she was still in shock, really, that her father is gone, is dead. And so, when we first met with this 11-year-old, she was still in shock mode. And to not, again, hasten the process of getting out of shock, because shock is also adaptive. Shock is an experience that helps us adapt because there's a lot going on, a lot to process, but only bits of information can be processed when you're in shock mode, which is, again, you're in like a very small part of your limbic system and you're just trying to kind of cope with what's going on. And again, children are constantly watching and learning from the world. And so that was an opportunity where we as providers at that point, when she was just still in shock mode, that it was an opportunity for us. I think a lost opportunity for us to model like just validation of her experience and validation of how shocking it is and unbelievable it is that she's not going to be able to see her father anymore. So again, you lean into the shock and don't be shocked yourself, so that you create your own panic system that that you start to flood and you start to panic and you start to respond to kind of the wrong things. So that's an example of what happens when you're not attuning to a child or an adult. Laura, if you can move forward, thank you. So attunement, again, in children, I can't emphasize enough, is attuning to both parent and child. providing psychoeducation to parents on attunement and where grief is processed in the brain and how it shows up in children, again, in emotions and behavior. And normalization of behaviors is such a primary focus for you when you're attuning to a parent or a caregiver, that there are a variety of emotions and therefore there are a variety of behavioral expression when a child is grieving. Because again, that's one of the key ways that they can express what they're feeling is through behavior, since they don't have mastery of language quite yet. And again, grief is not logical. So the behaviors therefore are going to be quite dramatic, and that's normal. All right, Laura, if you can move forward. So again, I keep going back to where grief is processed. And within the limbic system is the hippocampus, part of the brain where emotions are processed and therefore where memory, long-term memory is stored. And so that's why grief is processed that way, is because this is a meaningful relationship, a meaningful attachment, and you don't want to forget it. Again, like we are such sophisticated human beings in the way that we've evolved. And therefore, because long-term memory is stored in the hippocampus and the limbic system, that's why grief is processed there, so that it can eventually be stored there for as long as we live and consciously are aware, so that we can remain in attachment with that memory. One thing I wanted to share is that's why rituals can be really important across cultures, is that when you think about it, when you attend a memorial service, a burial, or a funeral service, you're actually transferring your attachment and your relationship from the physicalness of this person to the memory. Physical to memory, so that your relationship transfers from the alive person to the memory of the person, and therefore gets stored in our hippocampus so that we can continue that long-term and forever relationship with them in a different way. So my task for you all is to be, a limbic system whisperer. It's the best thing that you can do when you're using a trauma-informed approach. Because again, grief is not logical. It's not meant to be. So don't try to reason with it. Don't try to solve it. Death and separation is not reversible. So when you're providing grief support, the outcome is predetermined already. You can't reverse somebody's death. You can't reverse the pandemic experience. It's already happened and it's happening. So you're not paying attention to outcomes then, but what you're paying attention to is process and attunement and being present in the now. Pay attention to your cadence, how your voice sounds. Is it softer? Is it less confrontational? Paying attention to how your body is positioned when you are, providing grief support or when you're talking to somebody about their grief experience. And cadence doesn't necessarily mean you're going to meet with somebody for 2 hours versus half an hour. Get yourself out of logical brain thinking, but more into your limbic system thinking, where you can slow down the impact of time and not to be in a hurry. And I think you all know what that means of time is also very subjective. The experience of time is subjective, even though it's quantified. One of the best therapists I've ever had in my life that I met with was this person made an hour seem like I spent 3 hours in their office. There's a way to slow down the experience of time. And so that's what I mean about paying attention to your cadence when you're supporting someone. And enfranchise and validate emotions. I think that's one way to actually tweak the experience of time is validation of emotions, normalization of emotions, of grief emotions and traumatic emotions, and enfranchise them. Society as a whole, especially here in the Western world where we're always in a rush to fix and solve, as we end up disenfranchising experiences because we're meant to be prescriptive about what grief looks like, what it should look like, and kind of pathologize things. And so, again, I, you know, I'm reflective of how our own program lost an opportunity to really enfranchise that 11-year-old's grief experience when she said, "What are you talking about? You know, I'm going to actually see my dad very soon." So again, enfranchise and don't panic. You know, don't kind of press the panic button internally for yourself. And lastly, like the use of imagery and metaphor to help people. Because again, you're talking to their emotional brains and not their logical brains. So the use of non-language is very helpful across cultures. So imagery and metaphor connects emotional process to the cognitive process of grief, because there is a cognitive process to grieving as well. But it's mostly, again, processed emotionally. But to be, to be fully adaptive in your grief process, it combines both. But it takes time for the emotional process and the cognitive process to be linked. And again, using a trauma-informed approach, it takes time. So you can't jump to the cognitive process right away. That's not where trauma is processed. It actually interferes with that. So metaphoric images is actually a really great template to gain insight and understanding of a very illogical experience. And grief is not logical whatsoever. That's why it's so hard. It's hard to justify, it's not justifiable when somebody dies so traumatically and suddenly. That's not a way that you can make meaning out of that. You can make meaning out of your grief experience, but you can't make meaning out of a senseless death. And so again, sometimes the usage of imagery and metaphor is extremely helpful in the grieving process. If you can forward, Laura. So these are images that I've borrowed from parents that we've supported over the years here in the Journey program that have helped them. And so to the left of your screen was given to me by a mom who learned about this type of art form from Japan. It's called Kinotsugi Pottery. And as you can see, there's a lot of like gilding, random gilding in this piece of pottery. But this pottery was broken before. And in Kinotsugi pottery, you don't throw away the broken pieces of pottery, you actually put them back together again. And you put them back together again, and where you put them back together again are the cracks. You actually don't hide them, but you highlight them with gold. And so where you see where the broken pieces are the junctures with gold. And when the mom saw this, because she was having such a hard time internalizing and incorporating grief in her life, that when she saw this and when she learned about the Kinotsugi art process, this just kind of opened her eyes, and she gained so much insight in the theme of acceptance of who she is now, that she has been put back together because she broke into many pieces when her child died, but she's put back herself together again, but she's still broken. And instead of being ashamed of these broken parts of herself, she's actually highlighted them, and that she's learned a lot from her grief process, that she actually has gained a lot of wisdom, and she highlights that a lot in the way that she navigates the world now, in the way that she talks to people, and the way that she shares information. She was actually the one who shared this metaphor and art form in our conversations. And this was a number of years ago. And this just helped her with her own adaptation process, because again, it was so illogical for her how her child died, that this helped her place and put a framework of her emotional process into a cognitive one that she can understand and integrate. And on the right hand of the screen, this was a picture of a mother. She took this picture in the Woodland Park Zoo, and there is her son's favorite exhibit there is the flamingo exhibit. And so she visited this flamingo exhibit and took this picture. And if you can look into this picture, you can see that there's a duck there and prominent to the picture. And this duck is actually pretending to be a flamingo. It's trying to bark like a flamingo. It's trying to flap its wings like a flamingo. And as you can see, it's trying to stand like a flamingo too, with one leg up. And before she saw this, she was so struggling with being isolated since her son died. And her sense of belonging was just not there. She just felt like she was trying so hard to belong to society, because there was also this part of her that felt the need to be part of society, even though it was hard for her to be part of society. But the isolation was also just compounding the grief experience for her and getting in the way also of just having more of an adaptive grief process for herself. So when she visited this flamingo exhibit for the very, very first time since her son died, she saw this duck. And right away she said, oh my God, this is a message from my son at this very moment. And he's telling me, Mom, stop trying to belong. Stop trying to belong like this duck is. But like this duck, you need to be out and proud of being a duck in a sea of flamingos. That you can still belong, but you can stand out and be different because of your experience of grieving for me. And so this imagery, this metaphor became this concept of belonging that now she has integrated. And also it became a template for, or a conduit for a conversation with her 3-year-old son. And it was so powerful that there was this internal shift that happened for her when she saw this that day. Laura, if you can move forward. And gosh, so, mindful of our time, I wanted to make sure that we have some time for conversation. So I end there, and I end with this, what grief really is. I think grief for us, we really want it to be linear and progressive and prescriptive, but grief really is complicated, just like we are. Grief reflects humanity. Humanity is extremely complicated and circuitous. And so grief, of course, as a human experience will reflect that as well. That this is really what it looks like on the right-hand side. It is complex, it is layered, it is circuitous, and there's progression, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's like upward bound, that you're going to be, feeling awesome every day. But again, we also have built-in resiliency and an adaptation process. And so we really need to make sure we don't get in the way of our natural inherent capacity to adapt. And Laura, if you can move forward. So yeah, if there are any questions and comments and conversation, let's get started with that too.
I can kick us off, Alice. And I think it was really interesting hearing you talk about how much of the grief process is lived out through our limbic system. It makes a lot of sense because I was thinking about one of the things that happens just in our bodies as the seasons come and go and years pass. There are still these like triggers and memories in our environment. And I just have been going through them recently because my father passed away in April. And so there's a lot of things that just even the most innocent of things, tulips starting to bloom, but like subconsciously my body kind of goes into this like, how could it possibly be true mode, right? And so I just didn't know if you had any more you wanted to say about like triggers, reminders, things in the environment that using our trauma-informed approach, like how we can be sensitive to those things that come up for families and our families.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that question. And a couple of things come to mind for me is that grief is very seasonal, for sure. That grief gets, I guess, exacerbated, or what we call triggered, during times of change. And so when seasons change, that's when our body responds normally to change. Like, if you're not grieving, or you feel like, yeah, my grief has kind of resided kind of in the back of my mind more, it gets like put in the front a little bit more because your body is attuned to changes in nature. So it changes in temperature, changes in the amount of light that we experience, will bring forth things that also reflect the way that we respond to change, which is loss and separation and grief. And so know that, I'm very careful and very sensitive to not be overly enthusiastic when there's a change in sunlight here in Seattle with grieving people. I don't normally say, like, aren't you happy that we're getting more sun? I know we mean well by that, but it's actually quite triggering for people who are grieving a loss, that sometimes the sun is a passing of time. It's like one more season without my child, one more season without my father, and so you just want to be super sensitive and thoughtful about what your own experience is and not projecting that on to somebody else. And so I'm always neutral about seasonal change. It's like, yeah, spring has come. What does spring mean to you? So again, be curious and be like a limbic system whisperer. Ask questions more than just statements. And then, gosh, Sarah, like, again, I first of all, I want to say my condolences to you too regarding the death of your father. And again, just, be curious. Like, being a limbic system whisperer is requiring you to make space and ask questions rather than make assumptions. So I feel like I'm missing an answer there, Sarah.
No, I think that's great. And when you say to be very neutral, that's actually, I think, we don't get a lot of practice in that unless, we're, I don't know, mental health therapists with very busy practices or something like that. I think culturally in greater North American culture, I think there's a tendency to try to always swallow down discomfort and just say the things. Like when you were mentioning before, how are you? People say, oh, I'm fine, even though they may not be very fine, right? So I thought that was a really interesting thing to think about. And I'm going to start just checking myself when I'm out in public or talking to people at work or whatnot. Am I jumping to say something positive when I could be just neutral and it would actually be a little bit more sensitive or open to the other person's experience?
Yeah, exactly. So instead of, again, if you're wanting to know if people are ready to talk about grief, it's, you're going to need to nuance your questions to get to what you want to hear, So if you want to really know how they're feeling, don't say, how are you doing? Because that's too broad of a question. So ask a question such as, I saw you last week. It's been a week. And so I'm just wondering what has come up for you in the last week since I've seen you. So that's much more a nuanced question than what we typically ask. And that's when you'll invite somebody to say something for real, because that's not a question they can just say, I'm fine. They're going to need to describe how they're doing, So you need to ask a more expansive and spacious question for you to receive a more expansive and spacious answer.
Yeah, thank you. And that was Sabrina's question. I wonder too if there's anything else you would recommend to folks about any tricks about how to get people to tell you how they really feel, like maybe even just creating that space for them.
Yeah, that sense of spaciousness, again, asking expansive questions and not your typical check-in questions is one piece of kind of guidance. And then another is modeling, you could say like, gosh, I know so many Seattleites, and I use humor a lot when I normalize or model. It's like, man, these Seattleites like ourselves, like we just like, kind of go crazy when the sun comes out, people are wearing shorts already. It's kind of nutty out there. And, wondering if do you get kind of that same reaction or response when the warm weather comes? And so you kind of create this conversational, again, spaciousness between you two, that it doesn't, I'm not probing too much, because again, grief support is not about confrontation. It's about support and neutrality and spaciousness. So, even though that's like a closed question, meaning somebody could just say, no, I'm good. Yeah, I go out there too with my shorts, but the way that you say it is create spaciousness. So a lot of grief support and trauma-informed statements it's not the what that you say, it's the how. It's not the what, but the how. It's like, what is the type of energy you are trying to convey here? And for me, for people who are maybe just a little more closed off or just feeling a little afraid, like, I want to be able to convey that I'm a person that's not going to be confrontational, that I can ask questions, and you can trust me in not being in respecting like where you are. Like if you don't want to talk about it, I'm not going to force you to. So
Yeah. Thank you for that, Alice. There's a similar question here in the chat that I wonder if you could address. This person said the thing that was worse for me when losing a sibling was everyone saying sorry to me over and over. What are some neutral phrases that people could use to talk to those who are grieving?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, honestly, like it's so subjective and very personal in what people are okay with, because there are some people that are okay with even like, I'm really sorry that your son died, and again, it's even just how you say it that can feel okay for somebody to hear that. But a neutral way of saying it, and neutrality means also being honest, and so go with honesty. So again, because you don't know who this person is or what can feel right for them. So the first thing always, that lean with what you know instead of leaning to what you don't know. So instead of making an assumption, lean into what you know. So what you know at this point is, I don't know what to say. So you can say that in a supportive way. Like, I wish I knew what to say to you right now. I heard that your brother died, and I wish I knew what to say to you. And so lean into what you know. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, switching topics slightly. There's a couple questions in here about COVID. And one is just, how do we help families that have multiple losses over the last year due to COVID and other illnesses? Because it feels like sometimes grief compounds over and over again. And then similarly, there's another question about like just the collective grief that people are feeling. It's different than losing your intimate attachment. But curious if you could speak a little bit to that collective experience, especially as we're hitting these new milestones periodically and it's in the news, and how do you interpret that information even?
I know. I mean, you're right. Like the thing with COVID and lockdown intersected also with, our kind of collective also grieving for lives lost to murder, and mass shootings, and also just killings of brown and Black people, is that all of that gets exacerbated. And the thing here is that this has gone on for so long in this isolated way, that this is definitely, you can label this as not just collective grief, but collective traumatic grief. And that trauma and grief are processed differently. They are processed both in the same place in our brains, but the trauma is much more intrusive and long. And so it's over and over and over again. And also it becomes intrusive. I mean, look at the amount of information that we are attuning to also in our devices, on our screens, in our conversations. I mean, I feel like I don't want to even seek support right now sometimes, because the first thing people are going to say, like, yeah, have you seen the news lately? And I'm like, oh, it's not even supportive to me, you know? So I've been finding that I've been going through this up and down cycle. And I think a lot of people are. And I encourage you to go, to not prevent yourself from going up and down. I think the up and down vacillation actually is quite helpful in how we adapt to what's going on. And so when you're up here all the time of like stress, grief, loneliness, it's that's what creates trauma and fatigue. But when you vacillate, in the grief world, there's actually called a dual process model, and that actually helps with adaptation, is that people can go into loss orientation, meaning I'm thinking about my loss, I'm thinking about my loved one, to restoration orientation, meaning I'm going to go to work today, I am going to cook today. And so you need to give yourself time and space to vacillate between thinking about what everything is going on into daily living orientation. So you can't just stay in the stress mode. Like, that's not sustainable. So don't try to stay there. Like, you also need to distract yourself from things that are causing you stress. And you need to be able to restore when you're not engaging in the stressful information that you're engaging in. And so, it's not just pulling away from it. Like, you have to actively restore. So if that means like touching the earth and the dirt, if that is resonating with you as an outdoor person, you need to do that, because that's restorative. So it's not just rest, like, you have to actively restore. So if you're a type of person that needs more sleep than average, then that's what you need to do. So for me, sleeping more is not helpful for me, because I can function well, really well, with 4 hours of sleep. I know I'm not crazy, but that's just how I'm built. And so when somebody tells me like, oh, Alice, you need to sleep more, it's not helpful for me. What's helpful for me is, I am a collector of jokes. And so I search for jokes constantly. Because that restores me, like laughter actually is quite therapeutic. And so that's the type of restoration you need to do when you vacillate between stress and pulling back and restoring. So vacillation is very normal. So don't prevent yourself from vacillation during this time.
That sounds really important for caregivers as well, right? Like, most of this audience here were people in caregiving roles of one kind or another. And it can be very easy to fall into that, like, compassionate. Sometimes I wonder, like, is it me grieving, or is it the person I'm trying to help with the actual loss? And how do I check myself, and how do I restore myself? But do you have any more thoughts about that? What the caregivers, what those of us who are in the helping professions should be mindful of as we're working with families through their grief process?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, Sarah. And to nuance and redefine what love means for you, like, love is experience and gradients. I think for us as caregivers, we love everybody. We want to love everyone. We want to love the people that we're serving. We want to love our work. We want to love our coworkers, because this is what kind of drives us, but it's okay to love other people more. So what I mean by that is I need to take some time away because I love my children more than the people that I'm supporting. I love my spouse more than this parent that I'm supporting today. So I might need to reschedule. And so you need to experience love for what it is. Love is experience ingredients. And so don't be ashamed of that, that when your mind and your body is telling you like, I honestly don't have capacity to work and support this family right now, then you need to reschedule and be honest. And again, that's part of how we sustain ourselves with a period of isolation and kind of collective grief where we don't know yet where this is going to end. So if I did say like, oh yeah, there's certainty that this is going to end tomorrow, like we don't have that though, so I wouldn't be saying this if there is a certainty, but there isn't a certainty, an end date to this. And so it's giving yourself grace to say that there are people in my life that I love more than my work, than my colleagues, and the people that I'm serving. And so that's where I also need to be, because that's what restores me. And that's what also helps me find meaning in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, that is great. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic question here in the chat that there's curiosity about what your experience has been with emotions of guilt for children or in children during the grief process, because oftentimes guilt can pop up and it could be related to many different things. But what kind of helps for kids when that comes up?
Yeah. First of all, knowing what guilt is used for. Know that guilt has many different definitions for human beings. Guilt is kind of like the jack of, what is that? Like the jack in a card deck, like it can, or like the wild card, like it can function as different things. And so it's also like this, it's the stuffing that you find in new shoes so that it can hold its shape. You know what I mean? And guilt functions that way for human beings. It's kind of like a filler for when you don't know what you're supposed to feel. It's kind of our go-to default emotion when you're feeling ambivalence. And so sometimes guilt can also be a proxy for ambivalence, especially for children who don't know what feelings are yet. Like they don't have the sophistication yet of like, what am I feeling? I guess I'm feeling guilty because I don't know what else to feel, And so that could also just be ambivalence, meaning lots of different feelings that they can't name and don't know what it is conceptually. And so, not to, again, eliminate guilt, but to ask about it. Like, when you're feeling guilty, you just said that you're feeling guilty about whatever it is. Like, tell me more about that. Or like, if you were to describe it, like, what would it look like? Does it look green or whatever? Like, again, you need to gather more information so that they can help define for themselves what exactly does guilt mean. And then when they define it for you, you can either say like, oh gosh, boy, that sounds more like this. What do you think about that? So be curious and ask descriptive questions for them to help themselves and help you kind of delineate like what exactly does guilt mean internally for them. Because again, guilt can just be a proxy for ambivalence.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, my experience, sometimes kids will also take on the blame for something. Like, it must have been my fault that my dad died because I was whatever, bad in school, or I didn't listen when he told me to put away my toys, or all of these things. So when does it become important for you in working with children to kind of also distinguish, do a little bit of reality testing with them? Because like you said, you want to go with it and be curious about where they truly are thinking and feeling, but when does it become important to give them a little more information that might...
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, you're right, because there is a point where again, because they're children, they, as you all know, because you all work with kids, is that they really are, because again, their lack of kind of understanding of so many different things about how the world works and how the body works, that they do internalize like a sense of like in magical thinking that adults have also, but kids more so, like that is part of their emotional process is magical thinking, that I do have so much more control than I really do, I mean, because that is very common of like, gosh, I said that I hated my brother and then he died the next day, like it must have been that, I'm supporting a 17-year-old who she and her mother were both diagnosed with cancer at the exact same time. And she ended up living and her mother ended up dying. And the mom was experiencing so much pain towards the end. And she said, I was seeing my mom in so much pain because she was moaning so much that I prayed that night to God. I prayed to God. I said, God, please take away her pain. You need to stop her pain because she doesn't deserve that. And she died the next day. And she said, I'm so guilty. It's my fault. I prayed to God to take away her pain. And that's how he responded to me, was to kill her because the pain has stopped for her. So I think I asked for the wrong prayer. I should have been more specific, like take away the pain, but don't kill her, And so she felt super responsible for she was like, I prayed the wrong prayer. I really did. So it's my fault. And man, it's a lot of work and a lot of kind of trust that you build with a person with a child, especially who is experiencing that kind of guilt. And to not kind of reality test right away, but just to kind of have her explore that more, have her explain like, what other prayers did you pray for your mom, during her illness? What other prayers did you pray for yourself when you were really sick, And so just to kind of explore her world of prayers and the tons of prayers that she sent up to God, and when we were talking about that, she's like, oh gosh, I remember this other prayer actually. When I said that, I hope God, you can give mom a really good day today so that we can go to the aquarium because it's one of her favorite places. And we did end up going, and then the onus of almost the guilt, like dissipated and like blamed God there for a sec, she's like, I think he's playing with me. Like he'll answer prayers really well sometimes. And then the last one he interpreted incorrectly, so it's like it's God's fault, so, and again, it's the importance here is kind of like the vacillation between like whose fault it is, so that it's not, there's like movement in kind of in the way that she's thinking through, that it's not like concentrated and fixated on one explanation, so that's the thing you want to prevent from children and adults too, is fixation on one explanation for everything. It's like, there are kind of many explanations in these things that you're grappling with. Try this one for size, so you want to create kind of fluidity and flexibility in us, because that means you can adapt to things. So that's the process of non-fixation, is it helps you with adaptability. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That is great. And I know that you were talking just about how very personal a grief journey is. And at the same time, I'm sure you have some really good recommendations about children's books or other things that might help, especially with children. There was a question about that. And if you think of some, maybe what we can do is email that out after when we send out.
I do. I've got a not a super extensive, but I've got a list of books that I've also like in my, I don't know, like as best I can. I'm sure you can do it better too. So I've tried to do it by ages, like, 2 to 7 years old. These are kind of the list of books that I've seen kids that age enjoy or find helpful. So yeah, you can start with it and play with it. So, but yeah, I don't mind emailing that to you.
Perfect. Well, and we have a very little bit of time left, but I know we have a lot of home visitors in the crowd here who work with a lot of parents that have children kind of 0 to 3. And in my experience, there's often been sort of interesting things that have come up on home visits that I really just couldn't name, like what is going on here? And then only over time, getting to know that family very well, I've kind of learned, oh, there has been a loss of another child, maybe a sibling to this one, right? Or maybe, you know, a baby that was a very wished for baby that did not survive. And so then those parents are really juggling with how to say, like, how many children do you have? They don't know how to answer that question, right? And so just wondering if you have any advice for those of us who are working with young families, and just kind of that aware, like developing that inner sense that kind of something, there may be some grief and loss here in the background. What would you say?
I love that, Sarah. I love how you you totally like explain that, because I think that shows how intuitive we all are. You know, how intuitive, especially you all are when you're visiting the home, because there's just energy that you pick up on and you can't quite put your finger on it. And so listen to it. And so if let's say part of your assessment has to ask how many children you have, because again, there are these also prescriptive things we have to do for our jobs. I get it, you know, like we do have those in our assessment forms and the way that we have to do our work. There's unavoidable things we do. And so I'm not saying don't ask those questions. It's like ask them, because again, it's part of the work that we have to do. And when you feel something and they're like, when you see them hesitating or you feel like maybe you stepped on a landmine, then pay attention to that and ask, like, you know, I'm sorry if that question is difficult for you to answer. We can go back to that. Or, gosh, I felt like there was some hesitation there. Is there something that I asked that made you hesitate? And so again, don't be afraid to say sorry. Don't be afraid for repair. And again, as a provider, again, we are modeling repair also. So it's okay that you're going to step on landmines. We will. We can't avoid the landmines because landmines are inherently buried. They're not obvious to us. And so accepting that most likely you will end your job one of these days, or you already have. And so to say sorry and continue to repair it. But again, if you're feeling something, if you're observing also just in parent-child interaction, that it's like, gosh, there's something there, then put that as you know, something to ask when there is a window opening. So it doesn't mean like you ask right away, you acknowledge that you're feeling something, but you have to wait for the window to ask about it in context. So don't jump to like asking right away. So the thing with grief, remember, is this is not a marathon for people who are experiencing grief. It is a lifelong, or it's not a race, it's like a lifelong experience. So acknowledging it right away doesn't help anybody. You know, you're not racing to anywhere when you're doing grief support because the worst has already happened. You know, and again, there's no cure to, you can't reverse what has already happened. So don't race to it. It's like a lot of grief work and grief acknowledgement is a lot of patience when you're waiting for the window. You're waiting for, you know, for you to be invited to even ask a question that is relating to a possible loss. So don't be in a hurry. Again, don't press the panic button inside of you when you start to feel something. It doesn't mean you're ignoring it. It's like, okay, I'm going to wait for an opportunity that feels really respectful for this family.
Mhm. Yeah, and I know that for a lot of us in our different jobs, one of those little things that can be, as you said, like an unexpected thing that we trip over is just that a lot of us are required to do some kind of depression screening.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, what, I guess, how much significance to put on those screeners um, when we either know that a family is grieving or we don't know, but we wonder about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, if you're wondering, then they're kind of sensing that you're wondering about something, you know? So again, grief helps you attune to other people's energy. And so, don't hide it. And so if there is kind of, again, this opportunity, like, if you're looking at the PHQ-9 and but you're suspecting maybe that the depression or the answers are coming from a loss, then you can ask, especially if they're scoring high. It's like, gosh, I've noticed that out of 9, or out of these questions, like these are the kind of the things that are coming up for you. And, I'm just curious, like, are you experiencing grief for someone that you've lost recently? Like, part of this thing that we're talking about is actually like normalizing your own fear and uncomfortableness about grief and death and loss, because we are acculturated or socialized to fix something that can come up that's really provocative. And so you already feel like, I don't want to ask about this because I don't know anything about grief. It's like, more than like, don't think that you don't know anything. You actually have experienced a lot of grief in your life because you've experienced changes as adults and as children. So you know grief, you do. And don't fool yourself into thinking you don't know a lot, but you already do. Again, we have an inherent capacity to kind of recognize grief feelings and when something is a little off. That's natural for us. And so it's not just attuning to somebody's grief, it's attuning to your own antenna, and to your own kind of capacity to support somebody. And so do your own reflection. I hate calling it like, do your own work. It's like, oh my God, we're too exhausted about work already. Like, do your own reflection on yourself. Like, what do you know? What you know a lot already, like attune to who you are and your own experiences so that you can normalize these questions when you feel like asking them. So you're not stiff or tense. Remember, it's not the what, it's the how. It's how you convey yourself.
Oh, I'm grieving that I don't get to work with you anymore, Alice. The more I'm like, oh, I remember the way Alice tells a story. I just miss that so much.
Oh my gosh.
The last couple of questions that just popped into the chat. One of them is wondering about transference of our losses.
Yeah.
Present with someone who is in the grieving process. Do we share that? Try to stay present with their grief or feelings, or share your authentic feelings as they are happening?
Oh man, that is a complicated question. Whoever asked that. Well, again, know that transference happens. That is natural. That is just natural because we're always battling between a sense of authenticity and a sense of belonging. And so transference happens because you want to belong to that other person, like you want to process with this person, like that's how our brains are just built that way. And so don't try to, ignore transference is going on, but when there is like grief feelings that come up for you, again, you have to wait for an invitation for the other person that you can share it. And always centralize that other person's process because you are there. Like, who are you to this person? You are a supporter to this person. You are a provider of care for this person. So even like just admitting like who am I with this person, makes you decentralize yourself and centralize the family and the patient and the client that you're seeing. So if there is an invitation where they might ask you like, oh gosh, you're tearing up, like, what's wrong, Sarah? Like you can't say like, oh, I'm good, it's just allergies or whatever. It's like, gosh, I'm just, what you just shared there, it just is reminding me of something that I've just gone through a number of years ago. So thank you for asking. So that's being honest, it's being authentic without like centralizing yourself suddenly to share everything, and because again, like time is precious for you and for that other person. Even just sharing yourself, the risk is like when you share too much, when you're in your limbic system, time feels expansive. And so the next thing you know, when you're going into your own story, it's been 35 minutes and you only have 50 minutes with this person. So you've already taken up the majority of the time that this person really needs from you. And so that's the thing, is to be mindful of how much space and time your own process can take in that patient's and client's time. So that's what I mean about centralizing their needs. And then you can self-judge, like, how much can I share, knowing that I might slip into my limbic system and expand the time internally. So it's like, I can say like, yeah, your story just really touched a part of an experience that I had in my own life. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's authentic, and that's being honest, and that's being present without you going into too much.
Perfect. Well, one more resource thing, the Glacier Peak Institute is running a camp for children of military members this summer. They're anticipating at least a few participants who have lost their parents. And if you have any specific resources or advice for military youth, these will be teenagers 14 to 18. So maybe, I don't know if you have any in your list of resources. But.
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good one, right? Because experiencing like just a different way of loss in the military, it's very unique. It's a very unique population. And unfortunately, I think in the way that grief is defined in like military families, meaning, I guess what I'm making an assumption of is like a child who's in the military community that might have not lost a parent, but the experience of grief is because of just deployment. I guess, is that what I would just want to clarify that question?
I think they're just anticipating that they could have a whole mix, right? Kids who are even anticipating, right, that they could lose a parent one day. And that's kind of its own.
Yeah, it is. So again, thank you. Thanks for that clarification. I think it's important that you differentiate, because you also don't want to not water down, but have grief be like neutralized so much that it's like grief for the anticipation of a parent or a caregiver who's going to be deployed, versus maybe a child who's actually lost somebody, who's lost a parent because of the deployment or whatever it is, like an actual death loss, grief, is different. Like, I guess make sure that you're providing space for that kind of loss versus like also the anticipatory grief of deployment and the fear that this parent might die there. And so know that grief experience is different and nuanced. And so like when it's a teenager that is experiencing grief from an actual loss, there's a great organization called Wild Grief. They're fairly young. They're like maybe 4 or 5 years into their development, but they provide grief process by doing guided hikes for kids and teenagers especially. They take them up on these guided hikes so that it's not necessarily verbal processing, but it's processing through the use of nature and the expansiveness of nature. So if there is something that can come up, there are clinicians who can also support them while they're doing this hike. And they have these backpacking trips that I think they'll start up this summer with obviously COVID guidelines. But it's like a weekend backpacking trip that is, intentionally processing grief by following William Worden's like the 4 quote unquote stages of grief. Like grief is hard, grief has grief has hard feelings, and grief is also part of accepting where you are and all of this stuff. And so there's a theme each time they build a campfire. So it's pretty interesting. And then regarding like just the anticipation of the death that could happen when you get deployed, to me, like that's just another type of stress response that can feel like grief, but it's not. It's fear. Like fear is a component of grief. So it's a component of grief, but not grief. It's like, okay, let's address that anxiety and that fear. So again, I want us to be careful of what we label necessarily as grief and not, or a component of grief. So sorry to.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time, sadly. But I'm just there have been so many thanks coming through the chat, and people are just really appreciative of all of your insights, Alice, and we really appreciate having you here. Again, of all the things you could have chosen today, thank you so much for being with us. And I'm sure we'll be able to put all this information to good use.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. And it's so nice to see you again, Sarah. I grieve not working with you too. I really do. I am experiencing the stress of separation for sure from you. And Laura, what a wonderful way to meet you. I hope that we cross paths again. And
I hope so too. This was honestly just beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights. And yeah, I think this was great for our community.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you guys enjoy the outdoors, grab some dirt and feel the branches. It can be really good and healing.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Again in another quarter.
I'll see you.